Egypt in the time of the Pharaohs, a rich and powerful empire. But the people of Israel live in slavery, oppressed by a tyrannical Pharaoh. To win their freedom, Moses sends 10 plagues on Pharaoh's land. As God's fury, they sweep over Egypt. The plagues bring desolation, disease, and death. At least according to the Bible. Are they just legends? Or did these events really happen? The evidence led to the city of Ramses. The downfall of this great city came in a period of drought. Nature was out of balance. The river that guaranteed the survival of the city dried up. Red waters, frogs, insects and diseases, all the phenomena of the first 6 plagues could have followed. The eruption of Santorini helped scientists decipher the 7th, 8th and 9th plagues. The colossal amounts of volcanic ash led to climate collapse and terrible storms. Hail, darkness, and a plague of locusts are realistic scenarios. The death of the firstborn is the 10th and most mysterious of the plagues. It leads to the exodus of the Israelites into the promised land. The archaeological fragments build into a complicated puzzle. Recent excavations have begun to unravel the mystery of the legendary Hyksos. Were they the historical people of the Bible? There is no proof the Israelites were ever in Egypt, yet the name of Israel and the name of the biblical God appear for the first time in Egypt. Archaeologists are sifting through information from across the centuries to find the key to the story of the Bible plagues and of the Exodus. In the Old Testament, the account of the 10th plague is more detailed than all the others. It tells of the God Yahweh's final blow, the one that would free the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. God transmits his plan to Moses in precise detail. Every Israelite must borrow gold and silver jewelry from his Egyptian neighbors. God will make them agree. And then the Israelites must prepare the first Pesach ceremony. Moses is to go to Pharaoh one last time and announce the terrible 10th plague that is to come that very night. And Moses said, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt. And all the firstborn of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant, and all the firstborn of beasts." Towards evening, the Israelites mark their doors with the blood of the sacrificed Pesach lamb, the sign for God to spare them the horrors to come. It happens that night. The destroyer, the angel of death, passes through the land of Egypt.
The last plague is very different from the others. It isn't linked to natural phenomena. You could say it's a theological plague. It seems very cruel to us because Yahweh will massacre all the firstborn of Egypt. What does that mean? It means the total extermination of Egypt. Because in the ancient Middle East, the firstborn symbolized the future of a people. Losing the firstborn is losing the future.
Behind their bolted doors, the Israelites share the Pesach meal according to the instructions they've been given. The lamb must be roasted on the fire and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The Israelites are to sit at their table dressed for departure, and anything that isn't eaten must be burned. As promised, the God Yahweh does not harm his chosen people. Death passes over their houses. In the Jewish faith, this covenant for God's protection finds its ritual expression in the Passover ceremony. The second book of Moses says, "And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, What mean you by this service? Ye shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses." Silently, God's punishment is carried out. While the Israelites wait in their houses, death strikes down all the Egyptian firstborn, man and beast alike. There was not a house where there was not one dead. The great killing of the firstborn strikes every family without exception and without respect for rank. Even the firstborn son of the Pharaoh must die. With the 10th plague, the series of biblical disasters reaches its mysterious zenith and leaves behind a puzzle. The first 9 plagues the Hebrew scholars describe are comprehensible natural phenomena. Poisoned rivers, frogs and insects, disease, hail and darkness. All these could actually have happened in Egypt. But the 10th plague, dealing with the unimaginable, the death of the firstborn, remains an enigma. Attempts to explain it scientifically have looked at the possibility of an illness or an infectious disease. Poisoned wheat is one explanation. The Egyptians had stores of food, and when the harvest was poor, this was the only way to feed the people. But after the previous plagues of hail and locusts, supplies of grain could have been contaminated by humidity and the excreta of the insects. A lethal fungal mold could have been the result. Trichotocene, the poison of the Fusarium fungus, can kill both humans and animals. The male firstborn would have had first pickings of the limited food reserves and would have been the first to fall victim to the poison. Psalm 78 of the Old Testament has another explanation for the 10th plague. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt. Real plagues claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the Middle East in ancient times, but that wouldn't explain why only the male firstborn died. Like the Pesach offering and God's sparing of the Israelites, this is religious symbolism.
The 10th plague has the longest description because it is combined with a blood ritual, which was almost certainly a ritual of protection. It originated with the nomads and with the shepherds who used the blood to protect themselves against the desert demons who attacked their flocks or attacked the shepherds themselves. The Bible's authors are taking an ancient ritual and connecting it to the events of the Exodus.
The ritual of blood and the Pesach meal, which the Bible links inextricably with the 10th plague and the exodus of the Israelites, actually go back to an archaic festival in the ancient agrarian culture of the land of Canaan. Blood as protection, blood as a blessing. In the human struggle to survive in the rhythm of the seasons, it was the young men's job to move out of the settlements with the herds every year in springtime. This was the only way to protect the young stalks of corn in the fields from being eaten by the livestock. Before the young men left the community, there was a ceremony with a ritual of blood and a sacrificial meal for protection. In the Pesach of the Bible, the blood on the doors symbolizes this magical protection. In union with the one God, this mark becomes a sign that will ward off all dangers.
This blood rite, linked to the departure of the shepherds and shepherdesses, also helps protect the parents and children who have been left behind. Via the story of the night when Yahweh smote the firstborn of Egypt, this seasonal agricultural ritual became a part of the collective memory of the Israelites.
Zum Element des kollektiven Gedächtnisses Israels.
The 10th plague in the Bible story has a single purpose. It demonstrates the superiority of God over a godlike Pharaoh, and shows his power to lead his people from slavery to freedom. In the religious legend, the Exodus symbolizes the birth of the people of Israel. 600,000 men and untold numbers of women and children, the Bible tells us, follow Moses into the Holy Land. Archaeologists have found no trace of a human migration on this scale. And outside the Bible, there is no reference to a people enslaved in Egypt. Is there any historical evidence of the biblical Israelites and their story? In the 1st century AD, the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius quotes a source that recounts the biblical Exodus from an Egyptian perspective. The passages he quotes by the Egyptian priest Manetho offer tantalizing hints about the identity of the people of the Bible. Manetho gives a grim account of Egypt's darkest times. Under the rule of the legendary Hyksos, mysterious foreigners he identifies with the people of the Bible. They are said to have founded the city of Jerusalem after being expelled from Egypt. Manetho is said to have written, "People of an unknown race suddenly attacked Egypt from the east. They conquered the land easily without a battle. And once they had taken control, they burned the cities to the ground and destroyed the temples of the gods. They treated the people monstrously, massacring many of them and dragging the women and children into slavery. Finally, one of their number, named Salatis, became king. This account does not describe the people of the Bible as slaves. It tells of victorious lords and conquerors. Salatis was the first king of the Hyksos. Who were they? Are they the historical key to the Bible story? At the excavations of Tel el-Daba, archaeologist Manfred Bitak has been studying the Hyksos for many years. Here in the Nile Delta is the site of the city of Avaris, where the story of the Hyksos began in the 17th century BC. Very little is known of them. and there are few foundations and archaeological remains in these layers of earth to tell us about their times. With this single exception, this excavation of a great palace and administrative complex is of huge archaeological importance. It promises to reveal more about these mysterious foreigners who made themselves kings in Egypt and made Avaris the center of their power, their metropolis. Avaris had existed for centuries here in northern Egypt, where several trade routes come together. Immigrants from Canaan and the whole of Asia Minor made this city an expanding center of trade. By the 17th century BC, Avaris is home to merchants, artisans, and farmers. Among them, the people who would soon call themselves Hyksos. Manetho would later identify them as the people of the Bible. Soon they controlled the economy of the Nile Delta and filled the top positions in the administration. A success story that seems to conflict with the fate of the people of the Bible. To the Egyptians, the Hyksos, like all the peoples from the north, were quite simply Asiatics. But as successful merchants, shipbuilders, and warriors, they formed an elite group that brought advanced technology to Egypt. They introduced horse-drawn chariots and other unknown weaponry to the country.
The Hyksos is the name of a foreign dynasty in Egypt and not the name of a people. But we know they came from Asia Minor. And when the Egyptian kingdom fell apart in the 18th century BC, that is, during the 13th dynasty, it was easy for them to set up a vassal system. They took over the status of pharaohs quite officially.
The remains of a funerary statue found in Avaris can tell us what these Asiatics may have looked like. Notice especially the mushroom-shaped hairstyle and the colorful striped coat. The man's skin seems yellowish in color. The wooden scepter in his hand marks him out as an official. The search for these foreigners leads to the burial chambers of Beni Hassan, some distance from Avaris in Middle Egypt. These immigrants from the Near East are depicted on the walls, as the Egyptians saw them. They can be recognized by their sharp profiles, their beards, and their hairstyles, and by the yellow hue of their skin and the colorful patterns of their clothes. They're clearly different from the Egyptians also depicted here. Unlike the high officials at Avaris, these people belong to the ordinary population. Thus, the statue in Avaris is evidence of a remarkable social ascent for this immigrant people.
In my view, what we see here is a city aristocrat, a holder of very high office who portrays himself in a costume from Asia Minor. Just like the rest of the Asiatic population, he has not assimilated Egyptian style, but he has kept his identity. This suggests that the Asiatics in Egypt were extremely self-confident. But it's interesting that the Egyptians used the same word for Asiatics, amu, as they used for slaves.
These slaves became rulers. Their rise to power took place over centuries, until the Hyksos turned the old hierarchy on its head. We don't know exactly what happened in Avaris around 1650 BC, but it seems likely that this group of immigrants from Asia Minor took over power, They made one of their number king and claimed the status of pharaohs. This inscription engraved on a doorpost records the name of the new rulers, Hyksos, which means rulers of foreign lands. It's written in hieroglyphics so that every Egyptian can read it.
This was something unbelievable. For the first time, foreigners ruled in Egypt. These Asiatics had been known for a long time. They had settled in Avaris in the eastern Nile delta. When the central power weakened, they took their chance to grab power here. The empire was split into two parts, one in the eastern Nile delta and the other in Thebes, today's Luxor.
The Hyksos could extend their power in the Nile Delta without opposition. The wealthy trading center of Avaris became their capital. The palace complex that Manfred Bitak has been excavating since 2006 may have been their headquarters. These seem to be the foundations of a huge administrative wing. A geophysical projection shows the impressive scale of the Hyksos city.
Towards the end of the time of the Hyksos, Avaris reached a size of 250 hectares, and we estimate that 25 to 30,000 people lived in this city. That is a huge city for those times, perhaps one of the greatest in the entire Eastern Mediterranean.
The foreigners confidently continued to practice their own culture. Their rites and traditions spread. In Avaris, the nature god Baal merged with the Egyptian god Seth to form a new cult, the cult of Seth Baal. A new god is born, and under the Hyksos king Apophis, this god becomes the central deity. The worship of a single god was a concept entirely foreign to Egypt.
One can tentatively say that this was a first step to monotheistic thinking in the broadest sense. The expulsion of the Hyksos would then be connected to the idea that the Egyptians did not want to be forced to worship one single god.
Long after the Hyksos were banished, the Egyptian ruler Hatshepsut proclaimed, "I have restored what was destroyed when the Asiatics were in Avaris, and scoundrels among them overturned what was created, for they ruled without the god Re." When the pharaohs reconquered Avaris in the middle of the 16th century BC, they destroyed all traces of the Hyksos. The time of foreign rule was to be forgotten. But by suppressing the memory of the Hyksos, the Egyptians created a puzzle. Today, scientists face the challenge of reconstructing the truth about this legendary people from the smallest archaeological fragments. Are there, as Manetho claimed, parallels between the Hyksos and the people of the Bible? Or is his account an early example of spin and myth-making? Tiny traces of seals provide an answer here, not the vast remains of temples and statues. In the ruins of Avaris, Manfred Bitak has found several seals with human and animal motifs, and 6 seals with names. One is a biblical name, Jacob.
Memories of the time of the Hyksos may well live on in the Old Testament, through Abraham, Sarah, and above all Jacob and Isaac. One of the Hyksos kings is called Jacob, and several have Jacob as part of their names. These names are from Semitic languages, and they're later found in the Old Testament.
Die im Alten Testament weiterleben.
Does the discovery of the biblical name Jacob on a seal from the time of the Hyksos mean they could have been the people of the Bible? The archaeologists have found a pit that may hold some answers. More and more clay vessels, animal bones, shards and ashes are coming to light here. In the middle of the palace complex, in a courtyard 2 meters beneath the foundations. The scientists believe these are the remains of a sacrificial meal, perhaps part of a ritual of departure and farewell. The Bible describes Pesach as a sacrificial meal, after which all the leftovers had to be burned before the Israelites departed from Egypt. The sacrificial pit at Avaris suggests a comparable cultural ritual in which the inhabitants destroyed the remains of their meal, together with their pottery plates and vessels. From their analysis of the pottery shards, archaeologists have concluded that the palace was then abandoned. We don't know what could have caused the people in the palace to take this step. Were the Hyksos in danger in their own capital? They only ruled another 50 years in Avaris before they were expelled by force. Mid-16th century BC. For decades, the Egyptian pharaohs have tried and failed to regain power from the Hyksos and rule over all Egypt once more. Now Pharaoh Ahmose I retakes the city of Avaris and puts an end to a century of foreign domination. But the expulsion of the Hyksos remains a mystery too. In Avaris, there are no traces of a battle. Yet 30 kilometers away, archaeologists at the excavation site of Charu are working on a reconstruction of events. They found remains of the original fortifications. This was the crucial defensive outpost of the Hyksos in the Sinai Desert.
During the time of Ahmose, the military action was taken against Charu before Avaris, because Charu here has a military position to protect Avaris. The Egyptian was intelligent enough to think before attacking Avaris, to cut between Avaris and the east, to siege Avaris from the east, because this is the only entrance for Avaris. And I think that the battle against the Hyksos was here.
The fall of the fortress at Charu is a decisive victory for Pharaoh Ahmose I. It will lead to the expulsion of the Hyksos, and there is an eyewitness to his triumph. This unique account of the conquest of Avaris can be found at El Kap in Middle Egypt, in an excavated cave some way apart from the main dig. It's a report by a soldier, Ahmose Ebana, who fought with Pharaoh Ahmose I in Avaris. The inscriptions in his tomb tell of his wartime adventures. How he followed the pharaoh's chariot and fought at his side at Avaris against the Hyksos, and then plundered the conquered city. I was with the king when the city of Avaris was besieged, and I took my booty from there, 1 man and 3 women, in total 4 people. His Majesty gave them to me as slaves. Pharaoh Ahmose I and his army drove the Hyksos out of Avaris, and pursued them to their fortress at Sharuhen in southern Canaan. We besieged Sharuhen for 3 years. Then His Majesty took the fortress. I received gold for my bravery.
The rule of the Hyksos was traumatic for the Egyptians and remained so for a long time afterwards. For the Hyksos, Asiatics, miserable sand dwellers, were considered culturally inferior by the Egyptians. Actually, they weren't seen as really human at all. This rabble had come to Egypt and wrested power from the pharaohs, from the sons of the sun. That simply wasn't possible. By defending itself against the Hyksos, Egypt became an imperial power. It invaded and occupied Canaan and made it a colony.
The Egyptian priest Manetho wrote of a people who departed from Egypt and then were said to have founded the city of Jerusalem in Canaan. This led some to look for traces of a Canaanite people in Egypt and to turn their attention to the Hyksos and their period of power. Their names, their rituals, and their expulsion from Egypt are the main parallels with the Bible story of the Exodus. Did the history of the Hyksos influence the story of the Israelites in the Bible? Did the religious legend then give a new meaning to their expulsion? One in which the Exodus was no longer a defeat by the Pharaoh, but a victory over him. Yet the Hyksos were a ruling dynasty, not truly a people, and the existence of the Israelites at that time has not been historically proved. Manetho's account is just the first piece of this great historical puzzle.
The story of the Hyksos may have influenced the memory of the writers of the account of the Exodus. The Hyksos were indeed kings from Asia Minor, so they were very probably Semitic, like the later Israelites. And we know that the Hyksos left a lasting memory because the Greeks are still referring to them in the 3rd century BC. So it's perfectly possible that the people who wrote the story of the Exodus were thinking of the Hyksos. But they turned the situation round because the Hyksos were kings who were expelled, while the Bible story tells of slaves who were expelled or who were chased away by the Pharaoh.
The Bible texts were written 1,000 years after the time of the Hyksos. Was another people enslaved in Egypt during this time, in the way the Hebrew scholars describe? After the Hyksos leave, a new era begins for the Egyptians. The pharaohs take control of Asia Minor. Canaan becomes an Egyptian province. More and more prisoners of war from Canaan are taken to Egypt as slaves. Among them, a group the Egyptians call the Apiru, and whom they describe as crooks and bandits. They appear in Egyptian sources as mercenaries and slaves. A papyrus from the time of Ramses reports that they dragged the stones for the construction of the Great Pylon. Some scholars believe that these were among the first Israelites. The name Apiru later became Hebrew.
When you start looking for the origins of the Hebrews, you soon come across an Egyptian term, Apiru, which can be linked to the term Hebrew. For the Egyptians, Apirus were on the edge of society, whether in Egypt or in Canaan. Sometimes they worked as serfs for the Pharaoh, and sometimes they fought against him. It's perfectly possible that the word Hebrew comes from this term.
At the end of the 13th century BC, the name of Israel appears for the very first time on the victory stele of the pharaoh Meremptah, in a list of the peoples conquered in the campaign in Canaan. Israel is devastated and has no more seeds, the inscription says. The exact words leave no doubt. They refer to a people, not a country. Pharaoh Meremptah had advanced into the wild, mountainous regions of Canaan. Here he encountered not soldiers, but simple farmers, settled nomads who had begun to join with other small communities since the 13th century BC. They scraped together a living growing corn and looking after animals. They were the beginnings of a new, independent society, which would become the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Today, scholars know how the early Israelites lived. This reconstruction shows the typical four-roomed house that became a new architectural standard at the beginning of the Iron Age in the mountains of Canaan. Two parallel storerooms or stalls were located at right angles to the living area for people. Archaeologists found four-room houses like this that demonstrate the spread of a new social way of living in the whole mountainous region. The architecture of these houses helps us in the search for evidence of the early Israelites in Egypt. It takes us to the temple district of Medinet Habu in Luxor. Generations of pharaohs built their funerary temples here. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating the temple area of Ramses III found traces of the people who built the temples. Prisoners of war brought to Egypt as slave workers. They found the remains of their dwellings next to the ruins of the temple. The ground plans and the unusual method of construction were not Egyptian. Manfred Bitak went back to his predecessor's records. In the ground plan of the building workers' houses, he recognized typical elements of the Canaanite four-roomed house. And from that, he could draw conclusions about the origins of the people who had built them.
Ramses III had launched a military campaign in the Seir Desert. We believe that his prisoners of war were sent to work on the different temples of the empire. In this case, their job was to tear down the temples of Aia and Haremhab in order to build a temple for Ramses IV. That would have been in the 12th century BC. That was exactly the time in which the four-roomed houses were being built in Canaan and Palestine. And it's no coincidence that this type of house appears in Egypt at the same time.
The discovery of these houses in Medinet Habu is an indication that people from Canaan were in Egypt as slaves. Among the list of names of defeated peoples on the temple walls, there's an inconspicuous inscription that refers to the people of the Bible. Engraved in stone is the name Yahu, which will one day become Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. The people who worshipped Yahweh were nomads. They called themselves the Shasu Bedouins of Yahu. Illustrations of their capture by the forces of Pharaoh Meremptah in the Temple of Karnak offer a picture of the Shasu, the people who would one day unite with the growing community of Israel.
Today we can say the name of Yahu stands for this nomadic grouping, as well as for the region where they may have settled, and for the God they worshipped. Yahu was the name of their God. 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 Yahu was the name of their God.
And this form, Yahu, is also the basis for the name of God in the Bible.
These groups of early nomads have left traces in the Sinai desert. Puzzling signs in early Hebrew letters are carved in a wall in a mine near Serabit. Nearby, a relief shows prisoners or slaves being flogged by an Egyptian overseer. Are these references to the people who found their way into the Bible stories? In the copper mines of Timna, foreign workers like the Shasu mined ore for smelting in the Pharaoh's workshops. An inscription here provides further clues to the origins of the Bible story. It names a leader who experts believe could even be the historical model for Moses. This man's Egyptian name is Ramses Empere. He's from Asia Minor and has the rank of a court official. As an inspector at the copper mines, it's his job to mediate between the mine workers, the Shasu, and the Pharaoh's administration.
Ramses Empere hat in seinem
The name Ramses Empere reminds us a little of Moses.
Das ist ein
He was a diplomat who served under a number of pharaohs, from Ramses II to Ramses III.
zweiten bis Ramses III. Offenbar gedient hat. Und den
His services could be used in contacts with the Palestinian peoples.
zu dem palästinensischen Raum zu schaffen.
In the Bible story, Moses will lead his people to freedom. The earliest texts of the story of Moses and the Exodus are from the 7th century BC, a time of new beginnings under a young king. The disparate groups of the early Israelites have long since become a nation, living in the two separate empires of Israel and Judah. King Josiah of Judah dreams of an empire that will unite all Israelites. Jerusalem will be its capital, and it will serve only one God, Yahweh. There are still plenty of gods in this land. Yahweh is not without competition at the time the Bible is written. Archaeological finds show that until Josiah's reign, Yahweh even had a woman at his side, Asherah, the great goddess of fertility. There are many nature goddesses who are worshipped in religious rituals, but Asherah's cult is widespread. In the Temple of Jerusalem, her statue is on equal footing with that of Yahweh. King Josiah's reforms will break with a 1,000-year-old tradition, mankind's belief in a multiplicity of gods.
Ganz gewiss haben die Reformmaßnahmen des
King Josiah's reforms certainly led to a situation where monotheism slowly imposed itself.
allmählich verfestigen konnte. Und das dann in dieser Zeit
And the worship of Asherah as a companion god, sitting at the right hand of Yahu, as it were, could no longer be sustained.
nicht mehr aufrechterhalten wurde.
In a radical religious reform, Josiah elevates the cult of Yahweh to the state religion. The Temple of Jerusalem is the only place where Yahweh may be prayed to. Other religious cults are ruthlessly suppressed. Altars and cult sites are torn down, statues and graven images destroyed. And Yahweh's empire must be extended. The situation in the 7th century BC seems to favor expansion. Assyria's domination is breaking down. The small Jewish kingdom sees its chance to gain more land and greater freedom. But the dream of this ambitious king comes to a sudden end in the year 609 BC. Josiah has reckoned without Egypt. The old great power will be the doom of the young pretender. In Megiddo, a strange event takes place that puts the emerging biblical story in a new light. Pharaoh Necho II marches north with his troops. Josiah rides out with a small delegation to meet the Egyptian ruler. We still don't know what he hoped to achieve.
It looks rather stupid of Josiah. Why did he set himself up against Necho? But it may have made perfect sense to Josiah, the monotheist, the unquestioning servant of his Lord, who stands up to the arrogant Pharaoh and fights for freedom.
We don't know if Josiah wanted to assert national and religious independence by fighting the Pharaoh, or if he simply wanted to negotiate. But we're told that Necho II killed him in front of his followers.
For the Jewish scribes, even then writing the Old Testament, Josiah's death must have come as a terrible shock. The king in whom they had put their trust had been killed by the Pharaoh. If you read the story of the plagues against that background, you can't help wondering if the duel between Moses and the Pharaoh takes up this story, but in reverse. That's to say, now it's the representative of Yahweh who defeats the Pharaoh, and not the other way around.
This is the time when the Bible texts were being written. The fateful encounter with Necho recalls the confrontation between Moses and the nameless Pharaoh of the Bible. The political present of the Hebrew scholars and the folk memories of the past flow together in the Bible account and merge into a single great epic. The 10 biblical plagues are formed out of experiences and stories from different periods. In the legend that finally emerges, they have changed from natural events into the signs and miracles of God. All the waters turned blood red. Frogs and insects infested the land. Diseases ravaged man and beast. Hailstorms, locust swarms, and sudden darkness followed.
The plagues certainly did not happen within the space of a few days as they're described in the Bible. But every one of the first 9 plagues can be traced back to natural phenomena that existed in Egypt, and to an extent, still exist there today.
There's no scientific explanation for the death of the firstborn. In the religious creation myth of the people of Israel, the 10th plague, together with the Exodus, stands for the future and the freedom promised by God. Scientists have found no proof of the Bible story, but they have found traces of peoples who suffered expulsion and natural disasters, and whose experiences were taken up when folk memories were rewritten as history.